30 people. We have about 30 people who are joining us this morning or who have registered. So we're just going to wait a couple more minutes to make sure everybody is in the room and that there's nobody's flagging me on email saying, I can't get in, I can't get in. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the room and some brand new faces. Thank you so much for joining us. So welcome again, everyone. My name is Kelly Nevins. I am the CEO of Women's Fund of Rhode Island, and our mission is to invest in women and girls through research, advocacy, grant making, and strategic partnerships designed to achieve gender equity through systemic change. And all of those things are really important, but today we're going to talk about one of those strategies that we use to create systemic change, and that is advocacy, particularly through our Women's Policy Institute. If you are just joining us, just entering the room, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're logging in from. If you are affiliated with an organization, please let us know that. And then again, if you have any specific questions, please let us know. We're so pleased to have all of you join us this morning with interest in the Women's Policy Institute. And many of you may be asking, what is the Women's Policy Institute? Is this a program for you? This is a particularly complex moment for you because you want to make a difference in the world, but maybe you're not quite sure how. Some of you may be wondering how this is different from other training or advocacy programs. Some of you may be worried about what the cost is, if you have the time to participate, or how we plan to run during COVID times. Many of you want to be leaders in your community, possibly even run for office someday. And I imagine what's important for you is that you make the smart choices about how you spend your time and energy. So today we're going to spend about the next 60 minutes sharing information related to why more grassroots advocates are needed, particularly women, what the Women's Policy Institute is, and how to apply. How does that sound? I hope that's what everybody's here for. I see some thumbs up, some nods, great. So why does the Women's Policy Institute exist? Even before the pandemic, the United States had a gender wage and wealth gap that would take decades to close. And then COVID, of course, caused the she-cession, which threw into stark relief the gender and racial inequities that result from a country that treats women and particularly women of color differently than it treats its men. Issues like pay equity, sexual harassment in the workplace, and gender discrimination are directly impacted by work by leaders at the local and state level. And today, although we have 38% of our General Assembly made up of by women, we still know that we've got a long way before we achieve gender equity and certainly before we achieve racial equity at the highest level in our state. We know when there's a higher percentage of women in legislative roles, as well as advocating for change, that support for women's issues moves in the right direction. So what is the Women's Policy Institute? This is a 9-month program designed to train women who are community and nonprofit leaders from across Rhode Island. It is the second of its kind in the country, the first one being out in California. And the intention is to increase the number of community-based women who lead change in Rhode Island and who are actively involved in shaping and implementing policies that affect the well-being of women and families. The Women's Policy Institute draws from three philosophical traditions, which include feminism, social justice, and participatory democracy. As I mentioned before, it is a 9-month program with intensive programming that takes place one day every month on every step of the advocacy process. And this includes research, developing bill language, building relationships with legislators and key community stakeholders, creating media campaigns, and providing testimony. And the program includes a real life policy project. So while you are going through the Institute, you are working to affect change in the state. Now, you should know that the program is free in terms of there's no cost for you to pay to participate in the program. We have recognized over time, though, that there are other costs that fellows incur when they participate. And so in order to make it easier for some of you who may need this, if you need to take unpaid time out of work, we will provide a $15 an hour stipend for our program intensive days and or pay for childcare at $15 an hour for the same thing. It wouldn't cover all of the costs that you may incur for your time, but we hope that this will make the program more accessible and inclusive for folks going forward. So that's a brief overview of why the Women's Fund of Rhode Island has our Women's Policy Institute. What I would like to do now is introduce you to our facilitator for the past 2 years, who will go over sort of the broad aspects of the program itself. And hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot of your questions there. So without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Paula Hodges.
Hi, good morning. Joining you from my house in Elmhurst in Providence. It's lovely to see your faces. I recognize a few of you and I appreciate you giving some background in the chat this morning. Like Kelly said, my name is Paula and I have been a consultant facilitator for the Women's Policy Institute since 2019. And having worked in the Rhode Island advocacy ecosystem in the past, had also partnered with the Women's Fund and the Women's Policy Institute in earlier years since we brought it back in 2019. And fundamentally, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about how do we empower women and underrepresented communities to run for office, to be directly involved in advocating for intersectional issues that affect women and girls and families and women of color. The Women's Policy Institute is a great intensive opportunity to expand your network here in Rhode Island, to expand your reach beyond maybe your workplace or your community, to meet others who come from distinct backgrounds from all over the state, from different generations and sectors. And so I find that that network building and network effect is just as important as the curriculum that gets covered in the 9-month-long program. So the goal is we build a really strong cohort who can troubleshoot and rely on one another as you learn and navigate the political and policy process in Rhode Island, and that network lasts for long after. And we have some current and former fellows on the call who will speak a little bit more to their personal experience. But to cover the curriculum and kind of the arc of the program, we continue to evolve it, to be honest, to meet the current challenges of the pandemic and understanding that we have to understand intersectional oppression and how the system works at the State House, how the policy gets made, and how do you kind of intervene in that system. So there is certainly a curriculum, and I'm going to go through the different topics that we cover explicitly. But really, I think some of the more powerful learning is how to negotiate with one another, to narrow and decide what policy project you're going to work on, and to learn how to navigate difference in order to achieve policy change. So on I'm going to run through quickly and I'll copy them in the chat. And I believe these topics are kind of touched on in the background and the application. But the first session is a 2-day commitment. So normally the program is structured as one full work day. So like a 9 to 5 day a month. So from August through February, one Friday each month is set aside for a classroom experience where you are actively engaging and you are also having guest speakers and coaches come in and share their perspective on the issues that you care about, the Women's Fund cares about, and that they care about, and that you can ask active questions. I consider the format to be not that you need to have an undergraduate degree at all, but I consider it to be kind of like a master's degree, a graduate school level course, in the sense that peer learning is encouraged, it's not just lecturing. So the fellows themselves help teach the cohort about what they know as well. But that first 2-day retreat is really focused on building self-awareness and collective emotional intelligence of who is in your cohort, where do they come from, what are your intersectional identities? And we spend a lot of time building a strong foundation for the cohort to trust one another, to have some of the difficult conversations that we have throughout the course of the program. So the first session also includes a Strengths Finder assessment. If you've ever heard of Clifton Strengths Finder, that is also, I think, a tool you can have in your toolbox so you know better about your tendencies and your strengths around leadership development. And that first weekend, I think for this year, it'll be Friday and Saturday, we'll spend a lot of time kind of getting our heads wrapped around shared language and laying the groundwork for the baseline of what is the current landscape, political landscape in Rhode Island. The second session, the second, third, and fourth sessions really get into the tactical side of how does a bill become a law in Rhode Island? I saw some questions in the chat asking, will this largely be focused on Rhode Island's policies and the Rhode Island system? I work in international spaces or national. And what I will say is we will certainly talk kind of vertically and laterally about how policy gets made. And we will touch on the different levers you can use to change public opinion and move policymakers. But our main focus that we will kind of simulate throughout the program is the state level. How do you effectuate how a bill gets amended, gets written, gets signed by the governor or vetoed by the governor? And what are the administrative things you can do with regulatory agencies? We will bring in stakeholders from the municipal level, and we will touch on how the state interacts between the federal and local levels. But really, this is about a state kind of state level work. So we'll talk about how to lobby and how to persuade. So persuasive, conversations. How do you build relationship with people to be trusted, to move them over time? How do you draft and refine a bill? Of course, I am not a lawyer. You do not need to be a lawyer to help draft language. There are many stakeholders that are involved on the back end and the front end. And so we explore who those actors are, how to work effectively with elected leaders, both people who are in your camp and who are not, how to try to break down the nerves you get when you're having to talk to someone who is perceived to have power, and how to build your message, how to effectively communicate your policy issues so that the masses can understand. Often these are very complex issues that are not easy to explain. There's often a lot of systemic reasons for why there's a pay gap or healthcare disparities for women or women of color. And so how to break that down in plain language. How to leverage public spaces, so creating kind of pressure campaigns, grassroots campaigns, how to think about we will spend a lot of time discussing how to effectively partner with existing groups, because the expectation is this program may only be a finite 9 months, but if you are plugging in and partnering in good faith with community leaders and legislators, it is likely your bill that your policy project that you're going to choose to work on isn't going to pass in 1 year. Although it is very possible it could, we want to build an expectation that folks continue to work on their policy issue over time in good faith after the program. And we also touch on kind of the nitty gritty of budgets and how does the budget process work. The budget is definitely the largest policy that passes in any state or federal government. And that is often where a lot of policy is, lives or dies. If a program is not funded, it doesn't really exist, even if it hypothetically may be on the books. And finally, we wrap the program in the spring, in May, with a day dedicated to a campaign school. Now, this is nonpartisan. We are not saying you need or have to run for office after this program, but we do think it's really important that women be given the tools to understand how to navigate running for office. Given that there are often a lot of double standards for women to run, we want to give you resources. There's a ton of resources available to run for office. And our goal is to get more women to be in leadership roles, be it behind the scenes on a campaign as a manager or a kitchen cabinet advisor, or to be on an appointed board or commission, so we get parity even at appointment level roles. The way the program runs in terms of a flow is I would say it's intensive learning and cohort building from August to December. So this is where you're getting to know one another, you're putting systems in place, group agreements. I facilitate, of course, but there is a lot of self-directed learning and self-facilitation in the program. That's by design. And so you're spending the first half of the program, those first 5 months, understanding what the what is, who we are, and then you will explore for the first 3 sessions all the different issues, and you'll begin to bring your own personal issues to the group to propose as a group policy project. And then by November at the latest, the group will decide through a process to vote on one policy project to work on together. And it doesn't mean you have to stop advocating for the issues you personally care about. We encourage a wide array of advocacy and for you all to support one another. We had many fellows this year who were working on their own bills, and the cohort was supportive of those as well. But we pick a policy project to really dissect and to go all in on. And so after the new year, that's when legislative session actually is in session. And we have 2 more in-person classes in January and February. And then in March and April, we don't have a full day session on the books. Rather, that is where you are flying out of the nest and working inside the State House. So you're deploying all the skills you've learned to date, and you're self-directed. You're probably doing a full cohort call once, at least once every other week, maybe even once a week, to share intelligence, to delegate who's going to do what, who's testifying, who's helping find people to testify, who may be helping with grassroots pressure, who's liaising with the bill sponsors, who's sitting at coalition tables, et cetera. And then we wrap in May with the campaign school and with a celebration of all of your work. And then you are part of the Alumni Network, which is ever evolving and growing. You'll join 30 other fellows who graduated in the last few years. And then beyond that, there were about 55 or 60 fellows who'd been in former iterations of the program. So you join an alumni network to support your advocacy goals long afterwards. That pretty well sums it up. I'll turn it back to Kelly, and I'm happy to answer questions in the chat as well.
Thank you, Paula. And we will get to a Q&A piece in just a little bit, but what I would like to do next is introduce a current Women's Policy Institute fellow and an alumnus from the last class. And actually we'll start with the last class. We have Abir Katana, who, by the way, is part of the alumni organizing group as well. And Abir is going to share a little bit about her experience, why she joined the program, what she took away from it, and how she may be using what she learned today. So Abir, I hope that you'll join us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kelly. And thanks for laying out what I'm supposed to be saying, because I was going to ask you. I'm probably going to go in a bit of a backwards order, but it'll make sense. So good morning, folks. My name is Abir Kdana. I use she, her pronouns, and I am calling in from Boston. And I'll dive right in. But a lot of what Paula said really just brought me back to like my own cohort, and it feels like forever ago, pre-COVID. But yeah, I was in the 2019-2020 program. And there were honestly like three-ish main reasons that I joined. One, like super frankly, I wanted a career change. I wanted to move into the policy realm. And what I had been bumping up into before was I'd always get into like the last round of interviews, and then folks would say, well, there's no practical experience on your resume. And then somebody who had actually interviewed me later sent me this and was like, hey, if you'd done this, we would have hired you. And I was like, okay, that's a fantastic reason to do this. But also, I'm also super involved in community organizing in Rhode Island, especially around like maternal mortality for birthing folks of color. And I recognized that the sort of tools gained from this program would be super helpful and vital to the work that I'm already doing in my own life. And then lastly, the reason was that for so long, like Kelly alluded to, a lot of this work has been kept in the hands of people in power, which tend to be able-bodied folks, white folks, cis men, like folks who already hold power, who maintain power by having these skill sets and not allowing other folks into the space. The fact that this program is free was a huge benefit to so many of us who went through the program, because a lot of the time these programs cost a lot of money. So I recognize that like those three things were the main reasons that I like wanted to go into the program. And then this might be slightly all over the place, so feel free to ask clarifying questions. But in the program itself, right from the get-go, Paula really talked about this, and I really appreciated it. Even more than networking, like she said, it was just really about intentional relationship building. She really talked about how policy work was just about relationships. And if you're from Rhode Island, you know that who you know and how you deal with them is like all that matters in this state sometimes. But rather than even building sort of like transactional relationships with each other, she really guided us to really focus on like, what are our shared values? Why are we coming into this work together? How can we use those sort of like goals to do the work that we want to do together? Our cohorts were split into two groups because we wanted to work on two different policy issues. My group initially picked the topic of housing, and then when we researched it, we were like, there's a billion things going on in Rhode Island around housing. So we narrowed it down to source of income discrimination, and I can talk about this for much too long, so reach out to me if you want to learn about it. And that year didn't become law, but it very recently did become law this year. And as we were doing this sort of policy project, we recognized that, hey, let's look around at who's in the room, and we're not the ones that are actually most impacted by the issue that we're working on. And we really sort of grappled with that. Like, we're all bringing in our own privileges into this space too. So how can we make this authentic and not as if we're just moving into the space and speaking for other people? And what that really meant was recognizing that folks had been doing this work for decades and decades. And as part of this policy project, rather than coming in and rebuilding the wheel, it was our job to, exactly like Paula said, kind of learn about the landscape of Rhode Island and figure out who is doing this work already and kind of reach out to them and say, hey, we're this collection of people, how can we best support you? And we found a real success in that. Rather than coming in and telling people, hey, these are what we wanted, these are the things we want to do, we just asked a lot, like, how can we best support folks? It wasn't always the most glamorous. Some of it was like draft out an email, but it was what was most needed at that time. And as what Paula was saying, this timeline, I remember first looking at the syllabus and being like, this is insane. Like, there's no way that in 5 months I'll feel capable of going to the State House. But in 5 months, we were at the State House and people were giving testimony. We were meeting with legislators. Like, it somehow naturally just came together. And in the cohort itself, remember, it's not just you, it's going to be a whole collection of people that you've built really tight relationships with, and everybody's bringing in their own skill sets. We had people came in for a lot of different reasons, and we had a lot of different experiences in the group. There were business owners, there were moms, there were teachers, there were childcare providers, there were people who were already in policy, there were people who wanted to run for office. People come into this program for a multitude of reasons, and you'll find that 5 months in, they'll all coalesce and you'll figure out how to really work together and support each other. I'm still work very closely with some of the people that were in my cohort. And that's because when March came around last year, so we started off in person pre-COVID, it was glorious, and then COVID hit, and then the last sort of like few sessions we were all virtual, and there was a lot of struggling going on with that. And then last March happened, where recognizing that police brutality has existed in America since the foundation of policing, but the murder of George Floyd happened, and then like uprisings happened, and there was a lot of talk about how can we as a cohort best support that. And a few of us recognized that we really wanted to use the skills, like the very practical skills we gained from WPI, to kind of give back to the program. So we reached out to we reached out to the Women's Fund, and we were like, hey, here we are, how best can we support you? And Women's Fund had already been working on a series of priorities that they'd identified to really make this program more equitable, because recognizing this is still a baby program. I think this is maybe 5 years in, like they're constantly working to look back, hear from past alums, and work to improve the program. So we were like, hey, we're like 4 or 5 of us. We're a coalition of people who still want to be part of WPI. How can we support you? So for the past year, we've really been working on these sort of priorities to continue to make this program as equitable as possible. And we always invite more folks into that space. Out of that work also came this idea of creating like a alum network to support current cohorts, to support cohorts who had graduated. And that's still in the works, but you'll probably be getting like 1 billion emails from me if you do join the program about the alum network. But yeah, I think I went through the why, what, where, but Kelly, if there's anything you want me to add, feel free.
Thank you, Abir. That was fantastic. And again, we will give people a chance to ask all of our speakers questions. But next, what I'd like to do is introduce one of our current fellows, Emma Gauthier, who will share about her experience. And again, Emma, maybe just start with why you wanted to join the program, and then perhaps what the experience has been like for you and any key takeaways so far.
Absolutely. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is really a phenomenal program, and I signed on, I feel like we're the COVID class, like, it's just a sign of the times. And so I think that when I initially heard about the Women's Policy Institute, I was really not sure what I wanted to do in my career. I had been furloughed from my job, and I was kind of trying to figure out what my next steps were. And I was actually referred to this program by a former fellow, and I realized that this was like everything that I really cared about, and that this was everything I wanted to do, which is to learn about policy and learn how to effectively position myself in legislation to move things along. And so starting out the program, we had one in-person session where we met everybody, and we really got to put, like faces to bodies and to people. And, then we had to pivot, and we moved entirely remote for the program. And so it's been really interesting because, of course, like this is not a normal legislative session, and this is not normal time. So we really had to figure out, how we could stay connected, and how we could be working on different bills, and how we could figure all of this out virtually. And I think to our credit, like, I think, we figured it out. And so we ended up choosing the doula bill to work on, which was really interesting, and making sure that, we were connecting with the right people, that we were trying to do all this coalition building, and that we were, ensuring that we were helping this along, kind of like Abir said, without coming in and reinventing the wheel and sort of taking over. And so we had to pivot our strategy a bunch of different times to figure out, when meeting was possible, or, when different bill hearings were happening, and figuring out how to virtually testify. And so there were really, you know, I think when I signed on to the program, I thought it was going to be sort of this linear step of, okay, we're going to pick this bill, we're going to do this thing, and we're going to follow it through to the end, and it's just going to happen. It's going to happen in May and June when it's all over. And policy is really not that. Policy is not that linear. It's actually a really funny, complex process, and you know, things change, people intervene, you know, people testify or people don't testify. And so I think what I learned the most is that you just have to be flexible, and that this whole process is really, you know, that learning about testifying and that things get changed and that suddenly there's a sub A and what's a sub A, like all of these things are just part of the process. And so policy work really is, it's adapting, it's learning how to build relationships with people, it's thinking quick on your feet, it's writing a lot of letters, and it's taking a lot of time to work with people. And I really think Abir said it best, you know, it's all about who you know and how you can communicate with other people. And so our biggest challenge with the doula bill, you know, once it sort of got to the point where we had a clear vision of how we could help, is that nobody really knew what a doula was. And so our challenge and our goal was to really help push out the message as to what doulas were and how they operated and why it was important that their funding be covered. And so that was really, it really did come down to relationships and communication and all of these different things. And so this is just, I think overall, you know, looking back in August when we first met, you know, I couldn't have imagined that I would learn the things that I did. And I had a pretty interesting experience in policy before this program. And so I'd done a little bit of work, and I think I kind of knew the basics through what I'd done, but I really wanted to learn from a hands-on perspective. And I really wanted to get in there and see how this really shakes out. And it was so fascinating and it was so interesting. And we had phenomenal speakers from the Policy Institute Alumni Network, like Abir, and you know, through different alums for different programs. And this was just, it was phenomenal. I mean, I really can't say enough good things about this program, because it really helped me figure out, you know, where I wanted to position myself in policy. And it helped me figure out that, you know, there is so much out there that you can do. And it sort of just makes, you know, you just have to make the right connections, and you have to find, you know, what makes it worth it for you at the same time. So yeah, that's a little bit of a lot of everything, but that's kind of where I'm at this point, looking back on the year.
Thank you, Emma. And so we had a question that came through the registration page for either Emma and or Abir to answer. And it was, how did you manage the time required to be a fellow against your personal and professional other responsibilities?
I can answer that first. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think for my cohort, at least, and myself, it really went back to that intentional relationship building right from the beginning. So even before we decided, like, you know, this is the policy we want to do, we did like very intentional value setting, figured out like, why are we in this space? How do we want to navigate this space? And part of that included recognizing that to be there as our whole selves, we wouldn't be able to be there 100% of the time for everything. So how do we make sure that we as a group are strong enough to be able to handle all the things that sort of come at us? There's no way you'll be able to make every single 9 p.m. hearing. Like, it just won't happen. You'll need to really build a strong relationship for the cohort that you're in to be able to make sure that you can all sort of do the things that you need to do. Part of that also included sort of creating like a mini pod for ourselves, sharing what our strengths were, what our skill sets were, what we were really interested in, what we wanted to sort of contribute. And then as things came up, knowing who we could plug in because of the things that we'd already sort of established. Part of it also was prioritizing. Like, I had to really figure out, like, is this program what I want to do? It's time intensive. Are the things that I'm hoping to gain out of it worth it? For me, the answer was yes. So that meant some of my other commitments that I was already sort of doing had to go on the back burner a bit because I had to prioritize this. In the end, it is a time commitment. For me, it was super, super worth it. As I put in the chat, like, I got what I wanted out of it. Like I moved into the policy realm. I've used so many of the tools gained from this in my own community organizing and the work that I do personally as well. So, but what I would really say is do some value setting for yourself and do some goal setting. Figure out like why you're doing this, what you want to gain from it, what you want to give back to it. And then I think that answer will sort of like come out itself. Like it is a really big time requirement, but it can really be worth it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. I think, you know, from a different perspective, when I just heard that question, I was thinking about my employer and actually how they would allow me to go into the Policy Institute. And so I used to work for a wire service, a press wire, and part of our application, there was a portion where, you know, your employer will agree to either, you know, let you use your PTO or let you have that Friday to participate in the session. And my employer was really resistant in letting that happen. I wasn't working at the time, but I kind of had to figure out within the barriers of where I was, you know, how that would all pan out. And so what I really realized is that that was not the right career for me because they didn't share my values. And so it sort of helped me figure out that prioritizing what's important is really, for me, it's learning how to make the lives of women in this state better. And so it helped shape my priorities in a way that I decided to look for jobs, you know, within policy, and things kind of worked out differently in that regard for now. But I think what I realized too is that, you know, you are really part of a team here, and that this is really, you know, the cohort that I have is a phenomenal group of women who are so dedicated to what they do and who care a lot and who are so talented and awesome, that I felt like, you know, for different parts of projects or different things that we were working on together, I didn't want to let them down. And so it really felt like, you know, we were in this together, and we did pick one bill, you know, to work on as a group. And so we really did divide and conquer our strengths. And we went through and we made sure, you know, that we were utilizing everybody's skills to the best of their ability in whatever we did. And so for me, I'm a writer. And so I was really instrumental in helping kind of put together an overarching policy outline of the doula bill and what we knew and what we didn't know and kind of what we wanted to do and how we wanted to tackle that. You know, and some people are really great at organizing and outreach. And so we had some people form sort of an outreach coalition to go and talk to different players in this doula bill, and just we really leveraged our strengths all across the board. And so it was really, for me, it was a sense of teamwork. And so prioritizing this group and prioritizing the coalition, you know, I really wanted to make sure that we were doing our work together, and that, you know, we were doing everything that we could to make sure that we got the work done.
Thank you both. I'm seeing a question in the chat about the average time commitment. And so again, I would just note that you will know the intensive program days where you're coming together as a cohort. In fact, it's on the webpage where you would apply for the program. So you would know those dates up front. But beyond that, your group is creating agreements about times that they will meet to work on your project together. There may be some additional sessions that again will be scheduled with the group input in mind. You know, so expect that you have a full 8-hour day at least once a month for the intensive, and then probably a couple hours a week of doing project work and follow-up. Paula, yeah, so Paula is saying here the first few months you have 16 hours of session time in August, because that's a 2-day session that we do at the beginning that includes the Strengths Finder work, as well as setting your cohort intentions and whatnot. And she's saying 5 to 10 hours outside of session days. So, you know, it will vary. And certainly during legislative season, you know, you'll be trading off in terms of time that you may need to go and testify or to create written testimony. You know, together as a cohort with your fellow participants, you will find ways to work to get things done. Yes, Emma's saying I'll also add that after we stop meeting monthly, we decided to meet on Monday nights to keep track of the legislation and give updates on different aspects of the projects. You'll figure that out as a group. But again, to Paula's original point, you might think of this almost like a master's program in terms of its peer-directed learning. And so some of the things that you'll be learning together, you will schedule together in group to figure out how to make happen. Before I introduce Angela, what I'd like to do is take questions for any of the speakers beforehand. So that includes Paula as the facilitator, Abir as an alumnus, and Emma as a current fellow. Feel free to take yourself off of mute and ask your question, or you can go ahead and put it in the chat. So anybody feel free. Paula, I am seeing a question in the chat, which is, what is the mentorship structure like?
Sure. This is a evolving component that I'm excited to work with the Alumni Network on, and with Angela, who will be facilitating in the coming cohort, as well as the new full-time policy and advocacy director for the Women's Fund. In general, I have made myself available, and I think so have all the other Women's Fund staff, to help navigate specific questions related to your interest in policy advocacy as a career path or as a volunteer path, and to help guide and coach around your goals, be they personal, professional, or otherwise. And so there's been an informal mentoring component of the program, in that any fellow can schedule time with the facilitator outside of session to talk through what you're grappling with. If you're having, if there are things that have bothered you about the policies we're talking about, or that you may want to really talk through, we are always have an open door policy to walk through that. And beyond that, if you're thinking about going to graduate school or going to school in general, again, this is not a program that requires a college degree at all. If you're exploring a career shift, if you're exploring running for office, etc., we want to support you in getting further networked. This year, as we get oriented and head into August, which is hard to believe, we're talking about having fellows opt in if you want to be matched with a mentor based on what we do a thorough intake survey. So I know you filled out the application. We learn a lot about you through the application and interview process. But then once you're accepted into the program, we do a more intensive intake about what your goals are, what your superhero strengths are, areas that you want to work in. And it helps us to see the before and after. What's the effect of the program on your outlook, on your future career, and how you're thinking about your place in advocacy. And it helps us measure, the outcomes and outputs of how this program affects leadership development long into the future. So through that process, we'll ask if you want to be matched with a mentor in the community to help advance your goals. Not a lot of specifics yet about how we're going to do that, but the Women's Fund has a tremendous network, both of past alumni in this program, but also their board and their stakeholders. So many leadership programs have that component, and we feel that could be a good addition for this one.
Another question in the chat, Paula, for you is whether there is training in interpersonal communication and conflict management.
Oh, yes. At the end of the day, to get a bill passed to move multiracial or multi-issue coalitions forward, to be an elected leader, you have to be able to deal with conflict and to do it constructively and in a healthy way. And so we have increasingly focused on, I wouldn't even say it's conflict resolution so much as how do we build first inside the cohort group agreements. The cohort will arrive, that's like number one when we enter the August session. We come to group agreements, and then we continue to revisit those and change them over the course of the program based on needs of what is a quorum? The expectation is everyone shows up to all of the sessions. That if you miss more than one session, you may not be able to complete the program. The goal is if you miss a full day session, you're missing a really huge amount of information and learning. It's not fair to the cohort, but there's a lot of work happening outside of the classroom. And so coming up with group agreements about how do we make decisions by consensus? How do we work through difficult conversations? We've had supplemental sessions on Saturday mornings. The cohort decides on a supplemental time to talk through things that were difficult to talk about, or where there was misunderstanding around an issue or a dynamic. And so that is baked into the program. We have tried to add in some components around negotiation and how do you negotiate, and Kelly and the Women's Fund runs workshops on negotiating salaries, et cetera. I consider the ability to know what it is your ultimate goals are and what are you willing to bargain, what are you willing to compromise on. That is critical for getting actual policy change. Otherwise, you're going to get compromised out of real systemic change. So that is covered. It's not named currently as like a full session day topic, but it will be ever present throughout. Problem solving, nonviolence campaigning. The program is deeply involved with problem solving. I think you can't get into, intersectional and social justice change and understanding who you are and how you relate through your privilege, your race, your socioeconomic status without understanding that you're going to have to problem solve how you show up in the world against how others show up in the world. So certainly problem solving. I would be totally open. I think this program expands and evolves when fellows come into the program who have experience with something like nonviolence, civil disobedience, and other dynamics. I think we can't cover everything because the program does have a certain, I was saying, kind of a funnel approach where you start really broad and understanding the intersectional systemic reasons for why women don't have parity, systemic oppression. And then we narrow, in order to like have some focus and simulate how this cycle of advocacy works, we then narrow and funnel to one issue that you will then use as a filter to ask questions to navigate. So it doesn't mean we aren't learning big and tackling big issues and questions. It's not that once we pick a policy project, we only talk about the policy project. But essentially, this program could be a 10-year long program otherwise.
Paula, I'm going to interrupt for just a moment. And at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce Angela McCullough, who is our new Policy and Advocacy Program Director. Angela will be working alongside Paula this fall in facilitating the Women's Policy Institute. And she's going to share today some logistics about the applications. After that, the formal part of this morning's program will end, but I and Angela will stay on to continue to answer questions if there are any. But I want to be cognizant of time, and so we're getting close to the formal end of this program. Angela, could you please tell people how they can apply?
Yes, and thank you for the warm introduction for sure. So the application is as followed. So applications are accepted through June 13th. You can apply online at www.wfri.org/leadership. And I can certainly put that into the chat box. Each applicant goes through the interview process late June through July. The selection is completed in early August. There's a total of 20 participants that will be chosen for the fall cohort. And then we're also really being intentional with working to ensure a diverse cross section of participants. I think Paula had mentioned this as well, but the program will begin late August and will be held in person unless otherwise directed by local health authorities. And that's my spiel.
Thanks, Angela. Everybody should know that Angela just started last week, so we're giving her some breathing space to get up to speed on everything. But I did want to make sure that people got introduced to her because she will be so important to the program moving forward. So again, you'll see posted in the chat a link to the webpage where you can either download an application or apply online. Angela and I will stay on, and perhaps Paula, Abir, or Emma, if their schedule allows, to continue to answer questions. But at this point, I want to thank everybody for coming. The other thing that I would just note is that both I and Angela are happy to answer additional questions through email, or if you want to give us a call, between now and the end of the application period. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I also want to thank Ellie Brown, who is our other staff person here at the Women's Fund, for helping to manage the chat and get things recorded today. You will be able to go back to this recording on our Facebook page, and we also will be posting a link to it on our YouTube channel at some point soon. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the recordings, and then anybody who wants to stay on for further questions, please feel free. Thank you.